Hey everybody, this is TJR. Not too long after the passing of writer, comic book creator Stan Lee, political commentator and comedian Bill Maher responded with a blog post regarding Stan Lee and the fans who mourned his passing. There was a lot of outrage sparked by his comments, but there was one thing that I felt a lot of people just weren't touching on with their responses to this. So I wanted to talk about that in this video. Now I feel that context is important, so I want to read his initial post here. It's not long. You may have already read it, but I feel it's important that I first read this before I comment. The guy who created Spider-Man and the Hulk has died, and America is in mourning. Deep, deep mourning for a man who inspired millions to, I don't know, watch a movie, I guess. Someone on Reddit posted, "I'm so incredibly grateful I lived in a world that included Stan Lee. Personally, I'm grateful I lived in a world that included oxygen and trees, but to each his own." Now, I have nothing against comic books. I'll pause here and say I don't believe that for a second. I read them now and then when I was a kid, and I was all out of Hardy Boys. What this implies is that when he was out of so-called real books, he would read a comic book. But the assumption everyone had back then, both the adults and the kids, was that comics were for kids. And when you grew up, you moved on to big boy books without the pictures. Now, he's half right there in that regards. There was certainly a stigma to comic books in the generation that he was raised in, and I understand this because I'm part of that generation. I was raised with that same stigma. More on that in a moment. But, of course, this last statement basically states that if a book has pictures, it's not as grown up, it's not as adult. And then I'll get back to his blog here. But then 20 years or so ago, something happened. Adults decided they didn't have to give up kids' stuff, and so they pretended comic books were actually sophisticated literature. And because America has over 4,500 colleges, which means we need more professors than we have smart people, some dumb people get to be professors by writing theses with titles like Otherness and Heterodoxy in the Silver Surfer. And now, when adults are forced to do grown-up things like buy auto insurance, they call it adulting and act like it's some giant struggle. I've never even heard of this adulting term until I read his blog post, and I don't know where enjoying or appreciating a medium, how that ties into having trouble with being an adult. I think there are other reasons for that. Let me read the rest of his blog here. "I'm not saying we've necessarily gotten stupider. The average Joe is smarter in a lot of ways than he was in, say, the 1940s, when A Big Night Out was a Three Stooges short and a Carmen Miranda musical. The problem is we're using our smarts on stupid stuff. I don't think it's a huge stretch to suggest that Donald Trump could only get elected in a country that thinks comic books are important." Now, after this post, the first thing that happened was a lot of people took it as an attack on Stan Lee and his work. To be honest, this post is not that. What it is an attack on comics as a medium and the culture of comics fandom, the genre of superhero stories, and comic book movie adaptations. Now, first of all, I'm not even going to begin to comment on this connection he makes, that a culture that enjoys the medium of comics is responsible for electing Trump. This is ridiculous. You might as well say that a culture that listens to country music elected Trump, or that a culture that reads young adult fantasy novels elected him. But that's not the video I'm making today, and all of those are ridiculous conclusions to make. And by the way, for the record, I'm no fan of Trump, but these are all ridiculous conclusions. What I find most disturbing, and maybe I shouldn't say disturbing, most disappointing about what Bill Maher said, especially coming from him, because I've overall liked Bill Maher. I've enjoyed his commentaries, I've enjoyed his comedy, and I've enjoyed his observations, and I feel like he makes observations that no one else will, and I feel like he's done takedowns on politicians from both sides of the aisle when they say absolutely ridiculous, stupid things. And so it's kind of disappointing to hear him now basically do the same thing. Because here is the thing that I feel that nobody's really bringing up. What he's kind of doing here is he's saying this medium is only for kids, or this medium is not as good as this medium is inferior and this medium is superior, as if movies or TVs or written books, prose books, are superior to the medium of comics just because they are. Because how could a medium that has pictures in it possibly rise to the level of, say, motion pictures or TV or books? How is that possible? It couldn't be possible because it's inherently stupid or it's inherently for children. This is like saying horror movies are inherently for children. Science fiction is inherently for children. Westerns are inherently for children. Superheroes are inherently for children. Now, first of all, let me state that pretty much the majority of all media that gets produced, 50% of it is garbage. Maybe another 25% of it is just, yeah, okay. It passes the mustard, I guess. And the rest of it is really good to excellent. This is true of any medium. This is true of books. This is true of movies. This is true of television. It's true of comics, too. This is true of every genre of storytelling. I would say 50% of all Westerns, 50% of all spy thrillers, 50% of all science fiction stories, horror stories, 50% of romance stories are garbage. Maybe another 25% after that is passable. It's what remains where we get the really good stuff, from the very good to art. Westerns are not inherently stupid or brilliant. They're only as stupid or brilliant as the creative person behind the story that's being told, using that genre, utilizes it. Westerns can be as childish as they can be adult. The same holds true for every single genre, including the superhero genre. No medium is inherently greater or better than another. It's up to the individual, the creative person who is using that medium and how they utilize it, that determines whether or not it's bad or good. And by bad or good, I'm not talking in a moral sense. I'm just talking in the quality and level of writing, the quality and level of storytelling. And while I'm on the topic, I think I'll also add that the same holds true for music and every genre of music. 50% of all country music is garbage. 50% of all heavy metal music is garbage. 25% of that is passable. And then the rest of it ranges from really good to art. No one genre of music is inherently better than the other. It's what the creative individual, the musician, the songwriter, utilizes it, how they choose to utilize it. Country music and heavy metal music can be just as childish, lame, ridiculous, contrived as it can be brilliant and artful. It's all down to the creative person who's creating the work. Now, to a certain extent, I can't really fault Bill Maher for his comments because he comes from the same generation that I come from, more or less. A generation that was raised with a stigma regarding comics. Now, we nerds, geeks, comic fans, we live in a very different world now than the one from even 20 years ago. There was once a time when you could not be seen as an adult reading comic books in public. You would be ridiculed. You would be mocked. You would be looked at as some kind of a retard. I can remember in the 80s, I worked for the Parks and Recreation Department in a local city. And on the weekends, I would make a little extra money working in the park. I would check out sports equipment to the kids. I'd keep an eye on the place. I'd call the police if there was any trouble going on. Basically, I was there to babysit the park. I one day was reading Alan Moore's The Watchmen, which was at that time being serialized as a 12-issue series. And in case you're not familiar, Alan Moore's The Watchmen made Time Magazine's list of greatest novels of the 20th century. Not comic books, not graphic novels, greatest novels of the 20th century. And I was reading The Watchmen, and some young kids who came in to check out some sports equipment saw me reading a comic book and became embarrassed. I mean, really, you know how young kids get when they're really embarrassed and they think, oh gosh, what if my friends see me doing this? You know, they were afraid to be seen in the same room with me because I was reading a comic book. That's how bad the stigma was. Even kids thought that comic books were too juvenile for them even. And I was reading The Watchmen. So yeah, Bill Maher was part of that generation. And this stigma developed after the Comics Code Authority was enacted. This was after the Senate hearings during the 1950s. Dr. Wertham had published a book called Seduction of the Innocent. Claims were made that comic books were responsible for juvenile delinquency in America. And the comic book industry, as a result of these Senate subcommittee hearings against comic books, had to create their own form of self-censorship in order to stay in business. So they created the Comics Code Authority. And comic books were, as a medium, were incredibly tamed down moving forward. And it would take decades before they could lift themselves from underneath that oppressive self-censorship that they created. And I should mention that Stan Lee's work with Marvel Comics played a hand in helping to remove some of that oppressive self-censorship. And this is where, in my opinion, comic books got that stigma that this is strictly for kids. I know I was raised in that generation, and I was raised in that world, and I was pressured by my parents to get rid of my comic books, to sell them once I had reached the age of 13 or 14. And I'm sorry to admit that I gave in. I said, yeah, I guess you're right. I guess I should give these up. I guess these are for kids, and I should be more of an adult. I'm 13 after all. And so I sold my comic books, but I ended up coming back to them years later anyways and realizing that I was wrong and they were wrong. And while I am on the topic of music, I should also mention that I've enjoyed a lot of Bill Maher's commentary on music, even when I've not always agreed with him. But one thing I've always respected about him is his passion for popular music. And that's another reason why it's so disappointing to hear him criticize the popular medium of comics in the same way that a generation before criticized the medium of popular music, and in particular rock and roll music. I'm surprised that he doesn't see the parallels. Like rock and roll, comics during the 1950s were criticized and vilified as the cause of juvenile delinquency in America. And during the 1960s, so much of the youth culture found solace in the popular music of that decade. It communicated to them and spoke to them in a way that the rest of the culture did not. There's a similar parallel with the work on Spider-Man that Stan Lee and Steve Ditko did in the 60s. And this is why you have people saying, I'm so glad that Stan Lee was there, that I grew up in a world that had Stan Lee, because they would read something like his 60s work on Spider-Man, and they would see a character that they identified with in Peter Parker, not a test pilot or a millionaire playboy or a newspaper reporter, but a teenager, and an awkward teenager who had trouble in social situations, couldn't deal with that, who was bullied in school. And yes, young kids would read this and they would identify very closely. Anyone who's ever felt like an outsider or awkward or disaffected, they couldn't help but identify with Peter Parker. And these stories spoke to them in a way that the rest of the media didn't. And these Spider-Man stories, unlike, say, a Superman story, these were not power fantasies. Spider-Man got all these powers, or I should say Peter Parker got all these superpowers, but it didn't help him. It didn't make his life any better. In fact, in some cases, it made his life even worse. So yeah, these stories spoke to a whole generation. And of course, it's obvious that Bill Maher has never read these because he, once again, had the stigma that so many people growing up in this time period had about comics. I want to add that I still really like Bill Maher. I still think that he is a funny and interesting person to listen to, that he has very keen observations. I don't agree with everything he says, but there's very few people that I agree with everything they say. And this isn't the first time that somebody whose work and opinions I've respected has said something that really makes me say, no, sorry, you are dead wrong. This happens in life. This has happened to me plenty of times in my life. But it is disappointing to see Bill Maher basically act like the same people who vilified and rejected rock and roll. And this is because they don't understand what it is they're criticizing. I'm not going to do it here in this video, but I'm thinking maybe just for fun, and because it would be neat to expose you all to some cool comic book titles, that I will do a video called the Bill Maher reading list. These are comic books that I would recommend that Bill Maher read if he wants to kind of get a better idea and a better appreciation about what comics can be about. I don't expect him to ever see that video. Of course, there's no way he's ever going to probably see this video or ever watch that video, but I think it would be a cool way to basically share with you comic book titles that I think are important and that I think you should read, and I'll call it the Bill Maher reading list. Especially for those of you who are primarily here for my music videos and not my comic-related videos, this might be a good way to get introduced to some really interesting stuff that you might really come to enjoy. Let me know what you think of that. As always, please tell me what you think of this topic, and please tell me what you think about my observations. I'll look forward to hearing and reading what you have to say in the comments. And if you like what I'm doing, please, as always, click subscribe. Click that like button. Doesn't cost you anything to do that. Click that notifications bell icon so you can know when I release new videos. And if you want to take that extra step and help me to be able to make more videos, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter at my Patreon page. As little as $1 a month, as little as the cost of a cup of coffee, can make a huge difference. Thanks everybody for watching. Take care. Bye-bye.